We will now consider the fiscal year 2021 State and Foreign Operations Bill. My friends, having served on this subcommittee for 3 decades, as either chairwoman or ranking member for 2 decades, it is bittersweet to mark up this bill for the last time before I retire at the end of this Congress. Since World War II, long before any of our service here, foreign aid has been a key component of United States foreign policy. During my time on this committee, we have experienced pivotal moments that underscore the significance of the billions we allocate for foreign assistance to advance American values in promoting freedom and democracy and to support development and security around the world. On September 11th, nearly 3,000 Americans lost their lives, including some of my constituents who perished on the sacred ground where the Twin Towers once touched the sky. We need look no further than our mask and space seating to recognize we are living through another such moment. Coronavirus has claimed a staggering 540,000 lives worldwide, including over 131,000 Americans, and is another stark reminder that circumstances and events half a world away can have serious consequences here at home. The Foreign Assistance Bill embodies our common belief in the absolute necessity of effective global engagement. This is not only a moral imperative, it supports the safety and security of all Americans. As I reflect on this subcommittee's work, I can say without question that we have helped to make the world a better place. To highlight just a few achievements, we have stemmed the scourge of HIV/AIDS, helped provide food and shelter for families displaced by crises, intervened against atrocities, and advanced equity and opportunity for women so that they and their children might prosper. I am particularly proud of record levels of support for more than 80 million children globally, especially girls, to receive a basic education, which is the single greatest force multiplier in foreign aid. I'm also proud that we have stood up for women, providing basic health assistance through international family planning, which enables them to contribute to improved health and economic outcomes for their families and their communities. It has been my honor to work with all of you on this bill. I am particularly grateful for the strong bipartisan partnerships on this subcommittee and for the leadership of former Chair Hal Rogers and Kay Granger. Mr. Rogers, today's bill is stronger for your input on shared bipartisan priorities, and I thank you for your partnership. Now I want to highlight the bill before us today. With a total of $65.87 billion, it rejects the President's go-it-alone approach to foreign policy and expresses the committee's concerns about timely obligation and prudent expenditures. It provides greater distinction between short-term diplomatic, political initiatives and long-term investments in development for which unexpected events should not trigger the conditioning of aid. It also provides enduring funds with transparent accounting for critical overseas contingency operations, or OCO. The bill includes $47.85 billion in base funding, $8 billion in OCO funding for base requirements that otherwise would not be funded by the President's budget request, and $10.018 billion in coronavirus emergency funding, the need for which cannot be overstated. The dire expectations for COVID-19's impact on our health and economy demand urgent and sustained action. To ensure this pandemic does not derail decades of development gains, the bill provides $3.8 billion for development assistance. This includes $975 million to increase access to basic education, of which not less than $150 million shall be spent on girls' education in areas of conflict. It also maintains our commitment to addressing food insecurity, improving water and sanitation services, putting an end to trafficking in persons, and promoting other long-term development objectives that support thriving, healthy communities. This mark takes a holistic approach to global health programs by bolstering health systems in low and middle-income countries which face health threats and communicable diseases that we know all too well do not respect borders. To sustain progress against HIV and AIDS, tuberculosis and malaria, the mark provides $5.93 billion for global HIV/AIDS activities, including $1.56 billion for the Global Fund, and clarifies the U.S. commitment to maintain our 33% share. It also reverses the President's global gag rule and stops counterproductive restrictions on family planning and health funding, and provides $805.5 million for family planning services, of which $55.5 million is for the United Nations Population Fund. It also restores funding for the World Health Organization to ensure the United States maintains influence in the operations of an organization critical to the development and distribution of vaccines. To address policies of the administration that harm our neighbors beyond our southern border and drive migration, this legislation amends prior year appropriation acts to significantly limit the President's ability to redirect assistance outside of the region. It also maintains robust funding for counter-narcotics and law enforcement efforts in Colombia, Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean, includes $68 million to address international organized crime, and maintains funding to combat cybercrime. The mark prioritizes security of diplomatic and development staff with $6.071 billion for embassy security to protect diplomatic and development staff, which is $692.2 million above the President's request. It also provides $9 billion for security assistance to key allies and partners with support for programs in Eastern Europe, Jordan, and Tunisia, and keeps the commitments of the United States of America at Camp David to promote peace in the Middle East by providing $3.3 billion in aid for Israel's security as well as assistance for Egypt. The bill includes $7.83 billion in refugee and disaster assistance, including to Latin America, the Middle East, Asia, and Africa. It also restores humanitarian and development assistance to Palestinians to continue the viability of a two-state solution by providing resources to organizations working in the West Bank and Gaza. I am particularly proud that as a bipartisan priority, the mark includes $50 million for a new partnership for peace in the Middle East that would strengthen engagement between Palestinians and Israelis through people-to-people programs and promote economic development. The United States cannot tackle the world's challenges alone and must reclaim our position of leadership, lest the world become susceptible to the malign influence of actors like Russia and China who do not share our democratic values. This bill reaffirms our support for international allies and multilateral organizations, extending the impact of assistance, maximizing taxpayer dollars, and facilitating urgent delivery of aid to mitigate human suffering. Lastly, to honor our commitment to making the world better for this and future generations, we must combat climate change. The mark supports multilateral efforts to reduce greenhouse gases, to reduce the emissions, strengthens conservation and environment programs, and continues funding for adaptation and renewable energy programs at prior year levels. Before I turn to my ranking member, Mr. Rogers, for his statement, I'd like to thank the staff for efforts on this legislation under very difficult circumstances. Susan Adams, the minority clerk, Jamie McCormick of the minority staff, Austin Gage of Ranking Member Rogers' personal staff, my SFOP staff, including clerk Steve Marquez, Greg Higgins, Aaron Kolodziejski, Dean Kaloris, Jason Wheelock, Maren Stein, Jean Kwan, Celia Alvarado, and my congressional staff, including Elizabeth Stanley, Kelly Healton, Dana Acton, Wendy Corson. All of you, and more former staff and fellows than we have time to name here today, all of you have my heartfelt thanks. My and this committee's achievement are yours. Thank you, and now I'd like to recognize the subcommittee ranking member, Mr. Rogers. Do we have any water?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Congratulations on bringing forward the fiscal year 21 State Foreign Operations Appropriations Bill, your final one. You and your staff have done a great job getting us to this point under incredibly difficult circumstances. Before I discuss the bill, I want to take a moment to salute our chair. As I told her at our subcommittee markup earlier this week, Nita Lowey's commitment to this bill and the people it helps all over the world is well known. To me, this is best demonstrated by the fact that she decided to chair this subcommittee while also serving as the full committee chair. I know the time and attention involved in carrying out the responsibilities that come with leading the full committee. It's demanding work, physically and mentally. Yet, she still chose to make time for a busy state foreign operations schedule. Nita, I greatly admire your devotion to this work. We spent decades negotiating any number of issues, traveling to many corners of the globe, and getting bills across the finish line year after year. It's been a pleasure serving with you in our various roles at full committee and this subcommittee. We're also losing other important members of the committee, Congressman Martha Roby, Congressman Tom Graves, Congressman Will Hurd, Congressman Pete Visclosky, and Congressman Joe Serrano. You have all made indelible marks on this committee and this country and the world. I salute you all for your tremendous service to our nation and wish you the best as you transition to your next endeavors. Turning now to the matter at hand, the bill includes a total of $55.85 billion in non-emergency discretionary funding. This is an increase of nearly $1.2 billion over the previous fiscal year. The bill also includes $10 billion in emergency funding for coronavirus response. Within the total, the bill includes funding for many key priorities that are critical to our national security and that we can all support. I thank the chair for including $3.3 billion in foreign military financing for our great ally, Israel, and for your steadfast support for their security. I'm also pleased that the bill maintains funding at the current level for embassy security. The attacks on our embassy in Baghdad this year were a stark reminder of how we must do everything we can to support the safety of our Foreign Service officers working abroad and 260-plus installations. In addition, I appreciate the chair continuing funding to combat the flow of drugs into our country and to tackle transnational crime overseas. The bill provides $1.39 billion for international narcotics control and law enforcement, level funding from Fiscal 20. These efforts go hand in hand with the work we do here at home in the relentless fight against drug abuse and addiction. And Madam Chair, we're seeing another uptick in that death rate from overdoses of opioids since the advent of the COVID-19 problem as well. These are a few examples of investments supported in the bill by both sides. That's why I'm once again disappointed to the partisan policy writers included that are sure to end any bipartisan support. The sweeping measures included in the bill to overturn the president's policy of protecting life and global health guarantees that the bill has no hope of becoming law unless these provisions are removed. The bill also includes controversial funding and language on climate issues, the United Nations, and a range of other problematic areas. Finally, I remain concerned about unchecked spending. To echo Mr. Womack's comments earlier today, especially at this time of soaring deficits and debt. We need to carefully consider any increase in spending and the long-term consequences of such actions. Before I close, let me also thank the staff, both sides of the aisle, hard work, late hours, Susan Adams and Jamie McCormick from the minority staff, Jake Johnson and Austin Gage from my personal office, and from the majority staff, I want to thank Steve Marquez and his team, Aaron Kolajaski, Celia Alvarado, Dean Dolores, Jason Wheelock, Marion Stein, and Jean Kwan. They've all been great help in putting this bill together, and we owe them a lot. Madam Chair, I yield my time.
I'd now like to recognize Ranking Member Granger for any opening remarks she may have on the State and Foreign Operations Bill.
Madam Chair, thank you for yielding. During this time of instability around the world, it's important to remember that our investments abroad can make us more secure at home. The fiscal year 2021 bill funds many programs that would do just that. The bill provides $3.3 billion for Israel, demonstrating our unwavering support for the security of our great ally and partner. It protects funding for embassy security and counterterrorism programs. The bill also includes funds to advance global health, promote democracy, and address human trafficking. Unfortunately, while there are areas where we agree, I have serious concerns about partisan riders that have been inserted and the negative impact they could have. As I said during the subcommittee markup, the bill includes permanent changes in laws that would overturn the current Mexico City policy. This is controversial language that I hope we can reverse as the bill moves forward. I'm also disappointed to see that long-standing provisions aimed at enhancing transparency at the United Nations were removed. These conditions were first put into place when I was subcommittee chair and should be included in this legislation. Finally, as I've expressed many times this week, I'm concerned about the level of spending in this bill and many others. We had a budget agreement 11 months ago where we settled on spending caps. Now is not the time to reverse course without buy-in from members on our side of the aisle. To close, I want to thank Ranking Members Rogers, the former chairman of the full committee, for his leadership on this subcommittee. I also want to thank the hardworking majority and minority staff for their efforts, and I yield back.
Are there any other members wishing to make general comments on the bill?
Madam Chair.
Ms. Capter seeks recognition.
Ms. Capter is recognized.
I thank the Chair. I wish to thank Chairwoman Lowy and Ranking Member Rogers, as well as the committee staff, for their efforts on this critical bill that undergirds America's leadership globally. I first would like to congratulate Chairwoman Lowy for her many accomplishments, and know we are all grateful for her steady leadership as chair of this bill as well as the full committee. Her dedication to the advancement of liberty everywhere is well known and will be felt and remembered for years to come, and Nita Lowy will be dearly missed. During the COVID-19 pandemic, it is clear that threats abroad can make their way to the homeland. With over 132,000 deaths just in the United States, the administration's efforts have fallen far short of keeping the American people safe. Meanwhile, our nation continues to face other global challenges: a belligerent Russia, democratic erosion, rising authoritarianism, and a more aggressive China. The Chairwoman's mark ensures that the United States continues to carry liberty's flame forward through robust diplomatic and development efforts. And I'm particularly pleased the bill provides increased funding to support Ukraine's civil society and anti-corruption efforts. Ukraine is the scrimmage line for liberty in Europe today and is taking steps backward on its anti-corruption efforts. This includes purging the cabinet, the resignation of the head of Ukraine's central bank, and the politicization of the prosecutor general's office. Thankfully, the bill sends a clear signal of U.S. commitment to fight corruption in Ukraine, and it will also allow for the expansion of key Ukraine programs to boost rural women's microfinancing, veterans' psychosocial services, and key RADA institutions. Additionally, the bill provides for critical exchanges with the civil society in Central Europe, particularly Hungary and Poland, and I'm very thankful for the inclusion of the Pavel Adamovich Exchange Program, which will honor the Western Alliance legacy of the slain visionary mayor of Gdańsk, Poland. I'm also deeply troubled with the Trump administration's efforts to politicize the U.S. Agency for Global Media by purging senior officials. We must ensure that the firewall to protect journalistic integrity, including the critical Hungarian language services, is maintained. This bill does just that. Finally, I am concerned with consolidation across educational and cultural exchange programs. These misguided efforts will reduce program effectiveness, its diversity, and geographic inclusion. I'm pleased this issue has been addressed in the bill, and I thank the chair again and urge all my colleagues to support this very important bill. I yield back.
Mr. Fortenberry is recognized.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. First, let me note that this is a very important bill. It's really about three things: our national security, our diplomacy, and our development outreach efforts. And it captures the best of our mutual consideration and highlights also some of our philosophical differences as we work through these important areas. But I want to note a couple of highlights in the bill, Madam Chair. First of all, as you mentioned in your opening remarks, the Middle East Partnership for Peace. This is a new, innovative way to use development finance and traditional people-to-people programs that can make a real difference. Madam Chair, as you well know, any roadmap for peace needs a road, and any road needs a foundation. I believe this is this foundation, and I believe this is a highlight and hallmark of your distinguished career, so thank you for this initiative. Secondly, I'd also like to thank you for working very aggressively with Ranking Member Rogers on the developing concept of development finance, which is also a new innovative way to use our limited foreign affairs funds to help, as a force multiplier, counter Chinese predation in a new way that attacks structural poverty and creates regenerative economic activity for the world's poor. And finally, as well, I wanted to thank you for including my work on Plan Haiti. And again, another new way forward to help our neighbor to the south move past the trauma of the past and move toward an imaginative future. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Mr. Price is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I want to join colleagues on both sides of the aisle in thanking our leaders, Chairwoman Lowy and Ranking Member Rogers, for this collaborative bipartisan process that, while it didn't lead to perfect agreement, has nonetheless produced a very fine bill. Thanks to the subcommittee staff on both sides for its dedication, work on the bill and the report. The bill rightly rejects the President's proposed 20% cut to the international affairs budget, and it provides critical funding to programs, policies, and organizations that carry out U.S. foreign policy and help lift up some of the most vulnerable communities around the world. Some of these organizations include the Asia Foundation, the U.S. Institute of Peace for Peace, the National Endowment for Democracy, and its constituent institutes. I'm glad to see that the bill prioritizes this program that help build the capacity of democratic governing institutions, combat corruption, protect civil society, and promote the integrity of independent information. I'm particularly grateful for the support of the House Democracy Partnership, HDP, a bipartisan commission of the House which works with partner parliaments in emerging democracies around the world. As chair of this commission, I've seen firsthand the success of USAID's development and economic assistance as well as governance support. And, of course, we appreciate the work of organizations like NDI and IRI on the ground in nations struggling with financial hardship and conflict, as well as challenges to good governance.
Madam Chairman, I am very, very appreciative of your dedication and willingness to work together on this bill, and as you've done for so many years. In this bill in particular, we have protected funding for smaller countries that may get overlooked or left behind. We've worked to resume critical funding for the Northern Triangle of Central America for reasons well known to all of us, supporting two-state diplomacy in the Middle East, protecting our diplomatic corps and the career personnel at the State Department and USAID and international institutions, these people who are the bedrock of our nation's diplomatic efforts, all in the face of constant attacks from President Trump and many of his political appointees. Madam Chairman, you have steadfastly supported our work at HDP, and in doing that, you've continued a bipartisan trend that began 15 years ago when Jim Colby chaired this subcommittee. We're very, very grateful and much heartened and encouraged by the support that has steadily come from this subcommittee for our work. And we're well aware, alas, that this is your final markup as State and Foreign Operations Chair. You're getting, and you're going to get, a chorus of tributes from all around for the qualities of your leadership: principled, compassionate, persistent, and collegial. Those are important qualities, and they're qualities that are once again evident in the bill before us. So I salute you, and I thank you, and I look forward to working with you to see this bill through to passage. Thank you.
And I thank you. Ms. Lee is recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. First of all, let me thank yourself, Madam Chairwoman, and our ranking member, Mr. Rogers, for working to put this bill together, as well as let me thank all of the staff who have worked so hard to make this happen. And Madam Chair, I want to thank you for your visionary and your bold leadership as chair of this committee and our subcommittee, as you have constantly led efforts through this bill and throughout your leadership to ensure global peace and security throughout the world. And thank you for your friendship. And it's been a wonderful pleasure working with you and being a student of your abilities and your strategic decisions on how to put this bill together in a bipartisan way. So thank you very much. I'm pleased to support this bill, which represents really the best of American leadership in fighting problems that impact all of humanity: poverty, pandemic, and of course conflicts throughout the world. This year's bill contains vital investments to fight HIV and AIDS, to help African and Caribbean countries, which oftentimes have been neglected. The bill helps them strengthen their societies and build peace through diplomacy. It also includes a robust emergency component to help the world tackle the coronavirus. We have seen that this virus has really no respect for borders. The only way to truly defeat COVID and help America and the world recover is through international cooperation. It's imperative that America continues to engage with and support the United Nations, including the World Health Organization, so we can not only fight this current pandemic, but prepare for future pandemics. Finally, I think we need to consider this bill and all the bills that we will be taking up in the next week in the context also of racial equity in our own country. The movement for racial justice in our streets and communities and the slow but growing understanding of the role of systemic racism in our institutions has played in the tremendous disparities confronting African Americans in this country. We must view our funding priorities in all of our bills through the added lens of racial justice and work to provide the funding to meet this moment. As an example, the lack of diversity in our foreign service is a glaring example of what I'm talking about. It has been reduced from approximately 9% to 3% as it relates to African Americans. This is unacceptable. During my last visit to many countries in Africa, there were very few African Americans in our embassies and throughout our foreign service. And so this bill, Madam Chair, thank you for making sure that we have language as it relates to diversity and fund some of our fellowship programs and internship programs, which really would put us on a path back to racial equity in our foreign service. This bill has traditionally been a vehicle to support efforts to defend human rights and provide redress for historic wrongs, whether it's supporting a democratic transition in Sudan or helping African mothers provide their children with the education and nutrition they need to take part in a brighter future. I am proud to support this bill as one piece of an effort to support people everywhere to claim their rights and dismantle systems of injustice. Again, congratulations, Madam Chair, upon your retirement, but I look forward to our continuing friendship and our work together. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Cuellar is
Thank you,
recognized.
Madam Chair, and I want to thank you and the ranking member, Mr. Rogers, for the work and your staff for putting this bill, because as it's been said, this bill is about the United States diplomacy and our security and how we treat our neighbors across the world. I want to just mention a couple things that I want to thank you, Madam Chair, and the ranking member. One is the work and the support that y'all are providing to our neighbors to the south, Mexico. So the funding that y'all provide for justice reform, human rights, fighting crime and violence, and facilitating trade between the U.S. and Mexico is very important. I also want to thank y'all for the monies that we started some years ago with the ranking member, Kay Ranger, and all of us, with the money for Central America, the strategy for engagement to make sure we address that issue. I also want to thank you also for the funding for the international broadcasting operations, Voice of America. As you know, some of us have gone to Europe and seen the offices, but we also need to make sure that the Voice of America puts resources in Latin America because of the influence of China and Russia in Latin America. I also want to say thank you for the funding and the support for the Mayan forest area in Guatemala, Belize, and Mexico, and the Mosquita forest region in Honduras. Again, important for security, for governance, and basically scientific investigation and conservation. Finally, the last thing I want to thank you also, Madam Chair. As you know, I had an amendment that I was going to introduce that basically said that if there's any country that hosts a Russian or Chinese base, why should we reward them by giving them funding on that? Your language, consensus language, is to say that we'll have the Secretary do a report on those countries, and if anything needs to be classified, to give us that report. But again, we can't say, we're going to put all this money to fight the Russian and Chinese influence, then at the same time reward countries that actually host those military bases, Russian or Chinese. So again, I want to thank you for that. And Madam Chair, this is one of the last markups, that we have in this one. And I just want to say thank you for your 30 years of work that you've done. You've served your district in an honorable way. Thank you, and God bless you. Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Case.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I also stand in strong support of this fiscal year 2021 state and foreign operations appropriations measure for two main reasons. First, in funding our non-defense international efforts, this bill continues a cohesive strategy for advancing our interests and values and embracing the mantle of leadership across the globe. In doing so, it is a powerful and fitting response to the myriad of complex challenges confronting our world, most immediately the COVID-19 pandemic. Our allies and partners are clear that in these difficult times, they look to the United States to engage, stabilize, and lead, and it is in our national interest to do so. This bill answers that call by bolstering our commitments to diplomacy, development, and democracy, including by investing over $10 billion in international COVID-19 preparedness, response, and recovery. Second, this bill both refines and funds a cohesive strategy for advancing our interests and values in my own backyard, the Indo-Pacific. In this vast region that is charting our world's future lie our most committed friends and foes and everything in between, our greatest opportunities and challenges. Defense capacity alone, while critical, won't itself maintain our leadership throughout the Indo-Pacific. The greatest opportunities to sustain and boost our leadership lie here in this bill. I especially support the funding for implementing the Indo-Pacific Strategy and the Asia Reassurance Initiative Act, along with a new reporting requirement on Indo-Pacific climate security and greater focus on addressing illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing. Equally important is crucial funding for organizations that have proven their ability over decades to knit together the countries and communities of the Indo-Pacific in pursuit of common understandings and goals, particularly the East-West Center and the Asia Foundation. Additionally, our continued support of the U.S. Institute of Peace will direct focus on understanding and resolving the difficult issues that arise from renewed great power competition in the Indo-Pacific. Also of special note is the $411 million appropriated for the Peace Corps. Anyone in the Indo-Pacific, friend or foe, will attest that the Peace Corps has been and remains one of the most effective projections of U.S. leadership and values throughout the world. I'm especially pleased that in addressing the Indo-Pacific, this bill focuses as never before on the Pacific Islands themselves, the 12 independent states and another 12 associated jurisdictions that lie throughout Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia. For too long, this part of our world, as viewed from Washington, has been on the periphery of our foreign policy. Decades of consistent, albeit quiet, engagement with the Pacific Islands reflect the values and objectives we share with these countries and their peoples. Yet it would be foolhardy to take these relationships for granted, especially as China aggressively expands its presence on all fronts. To strengthen this focus in Congress, last year I joined other members in co-founding our first bipartisan Congressional Pacific Islands Caucus, and we will shortly join other members in introducing our Boosting Long-Term U.S. Engagement in the Pacific, or Blue Pacific Act, to establish a comprehensive long-term U.S. strategy for the Pacific Islands. We welcome the membership of all in our caucus and co-sponsorship of our bill. The bill before us and the accompanying report pave the way in including recommendations for security and development assistance for the Pacific Islands to strengthen maritime security and combat transnational crime, improve health care, address environmental challenges, reduce disaster risk, promote economic development, and strengthen democratic governance. The report also encourages our State Department to increase its diplomatic and development presence in the Pacific Islands, leverages our new Development Finance Corporation to invest in the region, and directs our U.S. Agency for Global Media to expand its coverage to the region and bolster press freedom. Collectively, these provisions will not go unnoticed throughout the Pacific and will reinforce our engagement in the Pacific Islands and the broader Indo-Pacific. In closing, I join all of my colleagues here in expressing our gratitude and admiration for your leadership, Chair Lowy, and service. The bill before us today, like those in years past, reflect your powerful vision for America's role in the world as a force for good. But I personally especially appreciate that you have personally understood and embraced the Indo-Pacific. Thank you for your stewardship of this bill, this committee, and our foreign policy. I yield back.
Ms. Wasserman Schultz is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank you and Ranking Member Rogers for your leadership on the bill before us, which advances U.S. foreign policy and upholds American values abroad. Congressman Diaz-Balart and I can assure you that in South Florida, with our very significant and diverse population of people from many different nations, we're the gateway to Latin America. And in South Florida, foreign policy is domestic policy. So this is a really important bill in our community. With over 130,000 deaths domestically and over 500,000 deaths internationally, it is past time for America to step up and show leadership in combating the coronavirus epidemic. And you do that in this bill. It takes an important step by funding global coronavirus preparedness, response, and relief. In this bill, we prioritize reproductive health, climate change, and contributions to international institutions that allow the global community to cooperate to address our planet's greatest problems. After President Trump's withdrawal from the World Health Organization in the middle of this global pandemic, Congress must be clear through action that we support international efforts to develop a vaccine and strengthen health systems abroad to be ready for future outbreaks. I'm pleased that this bill empowers countless women who are the backbone of their families around the world by increasing funding for family planning and health programs. We also provide critical support to women, many of whom face countless obstacles to accessing health care, by permanently repealing the President's global gag rule and contributing to our worthy partner, the United Nations Population Fund. When it comes to protecting the climate, we are putting our money where our mouth is in this bill. This includes support for conservation, environment, and renewable energy programs. Finally, Madam Chair, this bill extends a hand to the Venezuelan people who are suffering through instability and economic pain at the hands of the despotic Maduro regime. We expand aid for those struggling within Venezuela, along with the refugees fleeing economic collapse and repression. We provide assistance to Colombia, who has truly stepped up, as well as other neighboring countries that have been impacted by refugee and migrant populations. The bill includes funding for democracy promotion, human rights and civil society programs in Venezuela, and it also ensures there is funding available to assist Venezuela with a democratic transition if circumstances permit. I look forward to supporting this bill today and to seeing it come to the floor. Before I yield back, though, I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the incredible leadership and the remarkable and historic tenure that you have demonstrated, and the mentor that you have been to me. I know we are going to do this more fully later on in our markup schedule, but I will say that as a Jewish woman, it has been one of the highlights of my career to be able to serve with you, to see you ascend to the position of chair in this committee as its first woman, and likely the first, I'm not 100% sure about this, but likely the first Jewish person to chair this committee. So that means so much. It shows other young people in our community that anything is truly possible. Thank you so much, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you for your kind remarks. Ms. Frankel, wherever you are.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm here. Madam Chair, Ranking Member Rogers, my colleagues on the subcommittee, and to the subcommittee staff, I thank you all for your hard work on the bill. Chairman Lowy, it's been an absolute honor working with you. You have taught us how grace and toughness can be compatible. You know, if we've learned anything from the COVID pandemic, it is how connected the world is. So although foreign assistance is roughly 1% of the federal budget, it is still very important to our own security and allies around the world. And I'm sure we can all agree that the COVID pandemic will make everything we want to do much more difficult to implement. So I am very supportive of the emergency funding in this bill. There are many good issues in this bill, and my colleagues have really described many of them. I'm just going to highlight a few. The bill fully funds the $3.3 billion commitment for security assistance to Israel, agreed to in the Memorandum of Understanding signed by the Obama administration, recognizing the importance of the security of our long-standing ally. It also recognizes cooperative development projects to address sustainability challenges such as water resources, agriculture, and energy storage. The bill advances the proposition that when women and girls are healthy, educated, and free from violence and have access to capital, their communities are more peaceful and more prosperous. And we do this in many bipartisan ways. We support the implementation of the Women, Peace, and Security strategy to ensure that goals like empowering women as equal partners in such things as conflict prevention, peace building, are considered U.S. foreign policy and national priorities. The bill supports basic education, emphasizing the importance of prioritizing girls' education. It provides funds to combat gender-based violence, child marriage, and human trafficking. Funds promoting maternal and child health and fighting HIV/AIDS. It supports organizations that support women and girls at risk from violent extremism and terrorism, and funds the Office of Global Women's Issues and the Ambassador at Large for Women's Issues, which will work to empower women and girls around the world through U.S. foreign policy. And it funds women economic empowerment by funding the Women's Global Development and Prosperity Initiative. And most importantly, it repeals the very cruel, inane, harmful global gag rule and restores critical funding to the very valuable United Nations Population Fund. This is truly a bill that shows our understanding that when women succeed, the world succeeds. I urge support of this very good bill. I thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Seeing no other member wishing to make opening remarks, I'd like to recognize myself to offer a manager's amendment. Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. The amendment includes non-controversial changes to the bill and report, which have been approved on both sides. In the bill, it increases by $100 million funding for the National Endowment for Democracy and offsets the increase with a commensurate reduction of $100 million in the Economic Support Fund account. It also modifies the bill language under the corporate capital account of the United States International Development Finance Corporation to provide increased flexibility to the DFC in allocating funds across authorized activities. The report adds language regarding actions to be taken by the Department of State to better prevent cyber intrusions and protect personally identifiable information of department personnel, clarifying the committee's intent concerning expanded procurement opportunities for certain cooperatives, small businesses, and veterans, adding language concerning food insecurity and partnerships with the United States land-grant universities, concerning the Global Labor Program, addressing NATO standards and protocols on countering cybersecurity incidents, related to urban refugee protection, and expressing support for reforestation programs in Colombia. And now I would like to recognize Ranking Member Rogers.
Madam Chair, I support the amendment.
Are there any other members who wish to be heard on the amendment? Mr. Graves, I know we're going to acknowledge those we did not acknowledge at the beginning, but since you are speaking, I just want to thank you for your service, because I understand that you will be leaving us as well. We'll have to have a special thank you for all of us who are leaving, but thank you for your service. Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and let me congratulate you on 3 decades of remarkable service, and what a joy it's been to work with you as well. But I wanted to speak just for a moment on the manager's amendment, if that was okay. And
could you speak closer to your microphone? Or am
is that better?
Is that the best?
That's the best I have. Best I got, Madam Chair, but I'll speak a little louder.
Oh, now.
Chairwoman, thank you so much, and Ranking Member Rogers and Ranking Member Granger. I just want to take a moment and thank each of you and your staff for working with me to include several priorities to address our nation's partnerships and global cooperation on cybersecurity in this fiscal year 21 state and foreign operations bill. I think over the last few months, we have all seen firsthand how important secure networks and reliable telecommunication systems are to our daily lives, and we now understand the role that we play in ensuring that our allies stay cyber secure as well. So I appreciate this committee for recognizing the importance cybersecurity plays, not only here at home within our own government, but also on a global scale. So this means, as included in this manager's amendment, that we should be working with our NATO allies to ensure a standard response for cybersecurity attacks. And quite frankly, start asking the question, what actions might trigger an Article 5 response in the future? It also means ensuring our State Department has updated cyber standards and a full view of their IT assets to better protect against possible threats and malicious actors. I do also want to thank your staff, Madam Chair, for their time, energy, and assistance. Has been recognized throughout the morning here already, but it's important for me to include a special thanks to the majority staff members, Steve Marcase and Craig Higgins and Jason Wheelock as well. I know none of this can be done without everybody's help, and as well as the minority staff members of Susan Adams and Jamie McCormick, who've gone above and beyond to be responsive and helpful to me and my office. And then to the lesser known, to many of you, are some great staff members in my office that I'd like to thank, and that's Shivani Vakari and Max Berry in my office. They have put a lot of time and energy into making my last appropriation seasons one of the very best. So thank you to everyone for your many hours of hard work. And Madam Chair, thanks for giving me a chance to share a few words, and thanks again for your assistance in these bipartisan provisions being included. And with that,
Thank you, Mr. Graves, and I particularly appreciate your focus on cybersecurity. I don't know what your plans are in your next life, but this is one of the issues that keeps me awake at night, worrying what's happening, not just domestically, but internationally, our elections, et cetera. And I know we've done a lot in our bills in that regard, but there's so much more to focus on. So thank you again, and good luck on your retirement. I appreciate it. Okay, are there any other members who wish to be heard? Mr. Rogers.
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
Not yet. I'm told not yet. What's the... Okay. I close. But we'll get back to you. I recognize myself for 1 minute to close. I thank my colleagues for working with us to make the changes to the bill and the report, and I ask for your support. The question is on the amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. Are there any further amendments? For what purpose does the member from Kentucky rise?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will read the amendment.
Page 260, after line 8, insert the following. Paragraph C, funds appropriated under
Without
Title...
objection, the reading...
Funds appropriated under Title III of this Act and made available for assistance for basic education as provided for in this paragraph shall be referred to as the, quote, Nita M. Lowy Basic Education Fund, end quote.
I can't believe I was going to cut you off, my goodness. My goodness, that's so very nice. I want to thank you, my friend, for that very elegant amendment.
Well, Madam Chair, I offer this amendment to give credit where credit is due. This amendment designates the funding made available in the Act for basic education as the Nita M. Lowy Basic Education Fund. Our distinguished chair is admired and respected around the world because of her dedication and hard work in the pursuit of global development. And she is passionate about these issues. But her top priority is basic education. She's educated many of us on the fact that basic education is fundamental in building successful development programs. Madam Chair, your efforts indeed have been heroic, and your passion and inspiration to all of us and to the world. This amendment is intended to remind all of us to carry on your good work in your name, and we shall. I yield.
I normally say rise. I don't think we're rising today. Is that right? But I am in strong support of this amendment. The chair and I took turns as chair and ranking member of the State Foreign Operations Subcommittee. We shared many priorities, but no one can say they've done more than Nita Lowy to advance the cause of basic education, especially for the most vulnerable. Her legacy will be a generation of educated girls who will have the power to shape their future and ours. I mentioned in the subcommittee markup that when we get back to traveling to see programs funded in this bill, be sure to visit a school or meet with women in leadership roles in our country and other countries around the world. The chances are they have been touched in some way by the dedication of Nita Lowy personally. I look forward to supporting the Nita M. Lowy Basic Education Fund, and it's been wonderful to work with you. I yield back.
I could say I'm speechless, but I'm not speechless. I am very, very appreciative, and I'm not sure if either of you, by the way, came with me on a plane to Dadar in Pakistan. I don't know if anybody here was on that trip to Pakistan. And it was so dangerous, we wouldn't even tell the authorities of our route until we were almost there in the little plane. But to see those young women all dressed in white, so appreciative for our help, and all they asked us for, can you get us computers? Can you get us computers? So this is very, very meaningful to me, and I am very, very grateful. As I have said many, many times, education is the greatest force multiplier in foreign aid. We are losing our greatest opportunity by not ensuring the 300 million children who are out of school before the current crisis have this basic right. Now, with the closure of schools facing billions of young people and record-setting conflict and displacement, it is particularly important to address the educational needs of children and young people in crisis and conflict settings. When I joined the Congress, we were spending roughly $67 million on basic education. I am incredibly proud that this bill today includes $975 million for these programs. No room to cut, ladies and gentlemen. I am sharing this information with you because I'm so proud of the work of all of us in this room. $975 million for these programs. Please don't give up on these young people and get them back into school. A numbers even greater than before the current crisis. They are our best hope for better leadership, new discoveries, and a safe planet. And so I am so grateful to all my colleagues, in particular my good friends, Congressman Granger, and Congresswoman Granger, and Congressman Rogers. This means so much to me, and I am very, very grateful. Thank you. Are there any other members wishing to be heard on the amendment? If there is no further debate, the member from Kentucky is recognized on the amendment for 1 minute to close.
I think we understand fully the commitment of this lady over her entire career to the betterment of people around the world who are in desperate need. There's been no better champion for those people in the U.S. Congress, or in the country for that matter, than our chairman. And so we salute you, ma'am, and we wish you Godspeed in your next venture. I yield back.
Well, the question is on the amendment offered by the member from Kentucky. All those in favor say aye.
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 Those opposed say no. Ooh, I am very touched. Let me just say, I know there'll be other times for speeches, but I am so moved, so touched, and so appreciative. And as I look around this room, in addition to my good friends, Congressman Rogers and Grangers, who introduced this amendment, this wasn't the time to make speeches, but I can't resist telling how much I love and admire all of you. And I think what I will miss most is the interaction among really exceptional people. Sometimes our constituents don't get it, but those who have served here understand how special you are because you've devoted your time here just trying to do the right thing, just trying to make this a better place. And for most of the time, we work together to really try and serve children, adults, seniors, trying to make this world a better place. So I am very, very grateful. And as my friends and colleagues know, begins with education. And when we travel, and we have done some good traveling, some of us, and you visit the schools and you see these young people and you say to yourself, well, there is hope. If we can keep educating and investing in the education of young people, maybe someday some of the horrors of war and hunger and destruction can be an end. I hope we live to that day. Thank you so very much. I am very grateful. Thank you. Oh. The amendment is adopted. I was never good at parliamentary procedure. Amendment is adopted with appreciation. Okay. Where? Oh. The chair recognized herself for Lowy Amendment number 2. I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. My amendment would strike the Secretary of State's authority to suspend assistance to West Bank Gaza based on a determination. It makes clear that not less than $225 million shall be provided for development and humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian people in the West Bank and Gaza. As one of the most ardent supporters of the U.S.-Israel relationship and longtime champion for Israel's security, I believe the administration's indiscriminate cutoff of assistance to the Palestinian people over the last 2 years has perpetuated the very instability and distrust that now threaten any prospect for a viable peace process. This committee should lead the way in improving the situation on the ground by first restoring U.S. assistance for food and clean water, education, and health care, especially as COVID cases are on the rise in the region. Meeting these basic needs is not only the right thing to do, frankly, it's in Israel's interest as well as our own interest. The amendment better aligns the House mark with the letter and spirit of previously enacted authorizing provisions to ensure that economic assistance to the West Bank and Gaza resumes, which passed last year with strong bipartisan support, including among the leadership of the Foreign Affairs Committee. So I urge your support. I recognize Mr. Rogers.
Madam Chair, I arise in opposition to the amendment, which would strike a certification requirement on aid to the West Bank and Gaza. The State Foreign Operations Bill conditions aid for many programs in all corners of the globe. The new funding designated for the West Bank and Gaza under economic support funds is no exception. The change proposed in the amendment, striking a common sense determination and reporting requirement relating to security cooperation, makes the bill less likely to become law by weakening oversight of a program that is heavily scrutinized. So I urge a no vote on the amendment. I yield back.
Are there any other members wishing to be heard on the amendment?
Ms. McCollum seeks recognition.
Ms. McCollum.
I'd like to thank the chairwoman for offering this amendment. Humanitarian and development assistance to the civilians in the West Bank and Gaza is critical to supporting health, education, and infrastructure for the Palestinian people, and especially for children, especially for the education of children. Emergency food assistance, access to clean water, clinical screenings for cancer are just some of the essential services that have been severely impacted by the Trump administration's 2018 decision to eliminate U.S. assistance to the Palestinian people. This was not helpful for the peace process. Make no mistake, it is undetermined the prospects for peace, and it has been harmful, in my opinion, to the security of Israel. Madam Chair, I have been thankful for your leadership in fighting back against these cuts. I think this amendment only strengthens this legislation towards a movement of peace around this world and in the Middle East. And, as you pointed out, education for children. And I urge members to support this amendment. I thank you for it again, and I yield back.
Are there any other members wishing to be heard on the amendment? No. If there is no further discussion, I will close. Colleagues, you all know my record. I'm not here to needlessly stir divisions within the committee or score points on the subject of Israel. We could debate the Israeli-Palestinian conflict all day, but sadly, we will not solve it here today. By the way, I was committed to solve it before I left the Congress, but it's taken a little longer than I thought. So there's no way that I thought we were going to resolve it today. What we can do is ensure that life-saving, critically needed assistance is not politicized by our administration or the PA, and that it is delivered through trusted NGOs directly to the Palestinian people. In so doing, we can ensure that the United States regains our position as a defender of stability and peace in an area of the world about which we all care so passionately. That's all my amendment seeks to do. I urge a yes vote. Yield back. If there is no further discussion, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those. Was there an echo? Oh. All those opposed say no.
No.
The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted.
What?
For what purpose does the member from Kentucky rise?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will read the amendment.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading of the amendment.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The member from Kentucky is recognized for 5 minutes on the amendment.
Madam Chair, although I'm grateful that the bill maintains some of the long-standing pro-life provisions, I offer this amendment to address some of the most controversial language in the bill and restore language that protects the sanctity of life. First, the amendment strikes 2 provisions in the bill that prohibit the President's expanded Mexico City policy. That policy affirms our nation's respect for unborn life by requiring foreign NGOs to agree, if they want American tax dollars to support their work, that they will not perform or promote abortion as a method of family planning. Second, the amendment strikes a requirement to provide $55.5 million to the UN Population Fund, or UNFPA, and instead prohibits any from going to that organization. UNFPA has consistently violated the most basic respect for human life through its support for coercive abortion and forced sterilization in China, a severe human rights abuse in its own right. Third, the amendment strikes the requirement to spend not less than $750 million on international family planning programs. This is an unjustified increase of $175 million. Fourth, it strikes language added that weakens the long-standing Kemp-Kasten provision on coercive abortion, returning the text to what has been considered non-controversial matter year after year. Fifth and finally, it retains language on authorities carried for global health to agreed upon text in current law. Altogether, the amendment would bring the bill closer to the fiscal year 2020 bill that was negotiated by both parties not long ago. There should be no higher priority than these common sense measures that protect the unborn. So I urge a yes vote, and I yield back.
I recognize myself and rise in strong opposition to this amendment. First of all, I deeply respect my ranking member, but we fundamentally just disagree on this issue. We agree on many, many things in this bill, but this is an area where we fundamentally disagree. A woman's ability to thrive is dependent on her health and participation in society. The house mark we are considering will improve her opportunities. Once again, let me review what countless studies have already shown. Reproductive health services prevent unintended pregnancies, prevent maternal deaths and abortions, reduce the rates of infant and child mortality, empower women to stay in school and join the workforce, create stronger and healthier families, and improve economies. But as we sit here today, more than 200 million women around the world still lack access to modern contraceptives. If we want to build the self-reliance of countries, one of the most cost-effective measures is to increase access to family planning. This bill makes common sense changes to do just that. We've known from past implementation of the global gag rule that this policy actually increases maternal mortality. It also leads to more abortions, not fewer. Even so, the administration took this disastrous policy and made it worse by expanding it to all global health assistance, politicizing the provision of basic health needs. Since the expansion, implementers have been forced to close facilities, often in underserved areas, cutting off thousands of men, women, and children from services for HIV/AIDS, malaria, maternal health, and more. This madness has led to chaos and confusion, creating a chilling effect in which organizations unnecessarily change or eliminate vital health services for fear of running afoul of the United States government, denying these basic health services to poor women around the world. This amendment would cut off U.S. support for the UN Population Fund or UNFPA. It is impossible for the United States to provide assistance to every country in the world. Through partnership with UNFPA, we can extend our reach to millions of women who often have nowhere else to turn for life-saving health services. UNFPA is one of the few agencies able to work in countries like Venezuela, where in March they helped deliver 90 tons of health, water, hygiene, sanitation, education supplies to the country, including 28,000 personal protective equipment kits for health workers on the front line of coronavirus. UNFPA is also one of our most critical partners in humanitarian settings like Syria, Yemen, where it is often the only provider focused on ensuring women and mothers get the services they need. My colleagues would like you to believe that UNFPA provides assistance through abortions to support China's one-child policy. I want to make it clear, this is simply not true. UNFPA does not provide such services, and the State Department has not conducted a credible investigation to support these claims. Attacks on women's health, my friends, must stop. That is why this bill prioritizes saving lives, strengthening health systems, maintaining global health leadership over politics. I urge my colleagues, think about this issue. Think about the women who have nowhere to go to get this help. Please oppose this amendment. Ranking Member Granger. I yield.
I rise in support of the gentleman's amendment. I can't agree to reverse the important policies put forth by this administration to protect life. This amendment ensures that the current policy stays in place to ensure that organizations that provide abortions do not receive federal funding. It returns global health authorities to current law, reflecting the bipartisan compromise that has been in place for many years. Funds for UNFPA are also stopped because of the agency's practices and policies. We must have strong protections in place in this bill to ensure life is protected, and I urge a yes vote.
Mrs. Lawrence.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As the co-chair of the Democratic Women's Caucus, I rise in strong opposition to this amendment. This amendment will jeopardize critical and life-saving international family planning and reproductive health programs. There was a time in the United States where women would die at a very young age because of the lack of the ability to plan their pregnancies. The United States will be working to promote the rights of women and girls, not take them away. That's what we should be doing. With COVID-19, the risks for women and girls, the risks that they face are rising, and so it's urgent that we provide information and services to protect their health and safety. In Yemen, a country that is facing a humanitarian crisis, UNFPA is the sole provider of reproductive health supplies for the entire country. UNFPA's work in Jordan, where I had the amazing opportunity to travel to visit a refugee camp and see the introduction of reproductive options for women. We witnessed a woman have a baby who was 19 years old and was on her 5th child. Reproductive health is something that allows a woman to be healthy herself and to provide for the family and the children that she will have and conceive. Jordan, Turkey, and Iraq countries continues to be incredibly important, the work of UNFPA, especially as they continue to host millions of refugees. In the refugee camp in Jordan alone, UNFPA has operated a maternity clinic where more than 12,000 babies have been born without a single maternal mortality death. When women have the ability to decide if, when, and how many children to have, they are better provided, they're better positioned to provide for themselves and their families. Reproductive health is health care. Women's health care is health care, and health care is a basic human right. It's time to take the politics out of health care and support policies that will advance health and rights for all. We're not debating Viagra. We're not debating vasectomies. It's always the rights of the women, and it's time to stop it. I strongly urge my colleagues to reject any efforts to reject this amendment, and I yield back.
Mr. Aderholt is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I rise in strong support of my colleague from Kentucky, Ranking Member Rogers' amendment. President Trump has made his intentions very clear. I think his quote was, I will vote against any legislation that weakens current pro-life federal policies and laws or that encourage the destruction of innocent human life at any stage, end quote. Not that I might, but I will veto. Additionally, the bipartisan budget agreement for FY 2020 and 2021 stated that there'd be no poison pills that would be included in these appropriation bills, and this language clearly violates that agreement. The underlining bill is bad policy, it's bad politics, and it violates a bipartisan, bicameral agreement. So I would urge my colleagues to support the gentleman from Kentucky's amendment, and I yield back.
Ms. Frankel is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Ms. Frankel?
Thank you. Madam Chair, my. The attacks by my friends on the other side of the aisle on women's health never seems to end. It's not bad enough that the Republicans have defunded parenthood here in America, but now it seems you will go to the end of the earth to prevent women from having full access to reproductive care. Women must be in charge of our own bodies to determine if and when we bring a child into this world, because no one knows the circumstances of lives, especially the life of a young woman in Kenya or Yemen or Venezuela. We can all agree about the value of life, but what is life-saving about cutting off contraception, maternal health care, nutrition services, HIV/AIDS, and tuberculosis treatment? Because that is what this inane, cruel, harmful amendment does. In fact, a recent CAO report found that the global gag rule, since being reinstated and expanded under the Trump administration, has denied billions of dollars worth of global health awards impacting all kinds of services. Clinics are closing in the poorest, hard-to-reach villages because healthcare providers understand the importance of truthful communications with their patients and access to all safe legal options for the patient's care. Now listen to this. If a woman goes into an HIV clinic in Zimbabwe where they do not provide abortion services, and even ask the doctor where she can get an abortion, if the doctor answers truthfully, the clinic loses its money. Now, how ridiculous is that? And there's an irony to this whole predicament. Study after study has shown that the global gag rule has forced providers to either reduce services or shut down, making it harder for women to access contraception. This leads to more unintended pregnancies and more abortions. So give me a break. You're trying to stop abortions by causing more abortions? Adding insult to injury, a recent Guttmacher study estimated that even a 10% reduction in access to health care during the COVID-19 pandemic could result in 15 million unintended pregnancies, 28,000 maternal fatalities, and the deaths of 168,000 newborns. And who is on the front lines fighting these horrible statistics, providing critical care in remote areas? The UNFPA. And prior to defunding, the U.S. was the second largest donor to UNFPA and its second largest donor for humanitarian response. So, Madam Chair, let's be clear what the work of the UNFPA, here's what it does. It supports reproductive health of women and youth in more than 150 countries, which are home to more than 80% of the world's population. It supports the health of pregnant women, especially the 1 million who face life-threatening complications each month. It supports reliable access to modern contraceptives sufficient to benefit 20 million women a year. It supports the training of thousands of healthcare workers to ensure at least 90% of all childbirths are supervised by skilled attendants. It supports the prevention of gender-based violence, which affects 1 in 3 women. It supports the abandonment of female genital mutilation, which harms 3 million girls annually. And it supports the end of child marriage, which could affect an estimated 70 million girls over the next 5 years. But during the COVID-19 pandemic, the UNFPA has scaled up partnerships to avoid stockouts of critical contraceptives, medicines, and PPE supplies. It has erected mobile health care units in dozens of countries to bring health care to people's doorsteps. It continues to work in the world's most fragile humanitarian settings. And here's what UNFP does not support. It does not support and does not manage programs of coercive abortion or involuntary sterilization in China. In truth, Republicans want to cut off funding based upon a false narrative. Yet this is how the State Department has justified eliminating all U.S. funding to this critical agency to its global operations. And the State Department has yet to even visit UNFP's China program despite invitations to do so. So I ask you, where is the proof? This Republican amendment is not about life, because when you diminish the service of this critical energy, more girls will have their genitals cut, more young girls will be brides, and more women will die in childbirth. U.S. support for UNFPA is always important, but now more important than ever. My colleagues, when women have access to health care they need, the world will be a better place. Defeat this amendment and save lives. And I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Lee is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First, let me just say I associate myself with all of the remarks that have been made from the members who opposed this amendment. The Trump administration is undertaking a rearguard effort to deny women around the world the freedom to get the information that they need to make decisions for themselves about their ability and their desire to plan their families. The administration is going so far as to try to even impose this policy on groups that do not receive U.S. funding and to all global health programs, as the chair said. Now, UNFPA programs help prevent abortions and reduce maternal and infant deaths. For the life of me, I can't understand how Republicans would want to cut off funding for UNFPA, oppose comprehensive sex education, oppose access to family planning, and oppose access to abortions. I mean, it's mind-boggling. to believe that this assault on women continues. This amendment, rather than recognize the sanctity of life, of women's life and children's life, it says to women that her and her family's life, that they really don't matter. It's really a shame and disgrace to be this disingenuous. I remember being in Gula in northern Uganda several years ago, and we visited a family in a village. The family had 5 children, and we talked to them, and this was a bipartisan delegation, about their economic security and what would help them most in terms of lifting themselves out of poverty. And they said access to family planning. They had 5 children, and they said that it would be their desire to be able to plan for the next child if in fact they decided to have another child, but they wanted to take care of those 5 children that they had before they contemplated having another child, and they needed help with family planning. And so, Madam Chair, this amendment really is an amendment that denies the sanctity of life for women and men and children. And in fact, it is a matter of life and death for poor women throughout the world. And so I urge a no vote, and I hope at some point women become a priority for Republicans in terms of their right to make their own decisions about family planning, about contraception, and about how they want to live their lives and when and how they want to raise their children. Thank you again, and I urge a no vote.
Ms. Wasserman Schultz is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In the other room, I would rise, but I speak out in opposition in this room to the Rogers Amendment. Because sadly, this is another attempt to undermine women's health and access to family planning around the globe. It is wrong for the United States to force a health care provider in another country to choose between giving the best medical advice to patients or face giving up critical funding assistance. The global gag rule, which blocks U.S. federal funding for NGOs that provide information, referrals, services, or advocacy for legal abortion, is wrong. It is not just wrong, it is deadly. The consequences of the global gag rule have been dangerous. They include unintended and high-risk pregnancies, as many of my colleagues have mentioned, unsafe abortions, and higher maternal mortality. As the world confronts COVID-19 and its ensuing negative effects on healthcare access, especially for women around the world, we must strike down this harmful policy. Additionally, the fact that this amendment proposes to prohibit funding to UNFPA in the middle of a pandemic, an organization that improves the health of people in over 150 countries, is shameful. Without UNFPA funds, countless women will be left without access to family planning services and resources that prevent gender-based violence, which is increasing at an alarming rate worldwide. And finally, the inability to access critical reproductive health care puts providers and patients at unnecessary risk of contracting and spreading coronavirus. Slashing bilateral family planning funding in this bill isn't just anti-woman and anti-family, it's also anti-science and anti-life. I strongly urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment, and I yield back.
Ms. Kaptur is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I also rise in opposition to the Rogers Amendment that would cut critical funding to protecting women's health programs through the International Family Planning Services as well as the UN Population Fund. Especially during this pandemic, women and children around our world need access to health care services and counseling now more than ever. And I think it's important to state for the record that based on past experience, our country has actually helped prevent nearly 800,000 abortions, prevented nearly 5,000 maternal deaths, and treated over 60,000 cases of serious mental illness, and prevented more than 77,000 infant deaths. Now, this language would affect women who are impoverished the most. No funding for the UN Family Planning Program would actually mean women living in poverty would be reduced even more, and it's a sort of disdain for them, and their voices aren't very loud. I'm thinking of 3 places, and I'll go through them very quickly, where I have traveled. Some of us were on a defense codel to Egypt not so many years ago, but what I can't forget are the neighborhoods in Cairo, the conditions women were living in, and the Muslim Brotherhood was taking over the health clinics, if you could call them clinics, in that major city. And I thought, you mean we can't do better than this? And the U.S. Embassy sat behind sandbags, and I thought, we're not winning. We're not winning here. Health care is critical. In the West Bank, when I traveled there, I saw babies, children who were blue babies. And were it not for certain programs that exist, as well as private philanthropy, we would be losing even more children, more infant children there, and mothers with just simply impoverished women with no decent health care. And finally, in Ukraine, to talk to young women who have diabetes with no insulin and trying to bear a child, trying to live a life in a place like that, I really join with my colleagues in opposing this measure as being anti-woman, anti-children, and anti-life. I yield back.
If there is no further debate, the member from
Madam Chair, I'd like to speak on this.
Mr. Harris seeks recognition.
Oh, Mr. Harris is recognized.
Thank you very much, and I want to add my voice to those in support of this amendment, in opposition to spending U.S. taxpayer funds to fund an international organization that supports abortion. It's just that simple. This is not about family planning. This is not about contraception. This is about abortion. There are many international agencies that provide family planning, many international agencies that provide contraception, and they can receive funding. But this agency, the UNFPA, supports abortion, both explicitly and implicitly. It supported the China one-child policy for years, a policy that was a forced abortion policy, forcing women, not giving them the choice, but forcing women to have an abortion. That was wrong. And consistently and continually since then, the USFPA has supported abortion internationally. That's what this debate is about. This debate is not about whether you support women. It's not about whether you support children. It's not about whether you support life, although it is for those children who are killed by abortion. It's not about family planning. It's not about contraception. It is about abortion. It's just that simple. I yield back.
Ms. Watson Coleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I metaphorically rise in opposition to this amendment. I do have some adjectives that I think I can associate with this amendment that exposes it for what it is. It's elitist, it's contradictory, it's duplicitous, it's deceitful, it's arrogant, it's unnecessary, and it's counterintuitive. On the one hand, we give rise and voice to eliminating poverty, elevating education, supporting economic development, yet we are standing here defending the opportunity for women and for families to make a decision about what their families should look like, what they can and cannot afford to have and to do. I think that this is so wrong-headed, and I think it's just a further exposure of the duplicitousness that we continue to deal with with our members from the other side of the aisle as it relates to a woman's health care and her right to make decisions best for herself and her family. And with that, I yield back.
If there is no further debate, the member from Kentucky is recognized on the amendment for 1 minute to close.
Madam Chair, in closing, let me reiterate that this amendment would strike the most controversial language in this bill and restore language that protects the sanctity of life. I urge a yes vote and yield back.
The question is on the amendment offered by the member from Kentucky. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. No.
No.
The noes have it. The amendment is not adopted.
Madam Chair, on that I request a recorded vote.
A recorded vote is requested. All those in favor of recorded vote, raise your hand. A sufficient number being in support, a recorded vote is ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt. Mr. Adderholt, aye. Mr. Aguilar. Mr. Aguilar, no. Mr. Amadei. Mr. Amadei, aye. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop, no. Mrs. Bustos. Mrs. Bustos, no. Mr. Calvert. Mr. Calvert, aye. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter, aye. Mr. Cartwright.
No.
Mr. Cartwright, no. Mr. Case. Mr. Case, no. Ms. Clark.
No.
Ms. Clark, no. Mr. Cole.
Aye.
Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Christ. Mr. Christ, no. Mr. Cuellar. Mr. Cuellar, no. Ms. DeLauro. Mr. DeLauro, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart, aye. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Fleischman, aye. Mr. Fortenberry.
Yes.
Mr. Fortenberry, aye. Ms. Frankel.
No.
Ms. Frankel, no. Ms. Granger.
Aye.
Ms. Granger, aye. Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves, aye. Dr. Harris. Dr. Harris, aye. Ms. Herrera-Butler. Mr. Herrera-Butler, aye. Mr. Hurd. Mr. Hurd, aye. Mr. Joyce. Mr. Joyce. Mr. Joyce, aye. Ms. Capter. Ms. Capter, no. Mr. Kilmer. Mr. Kilmer, no. Mrs. Kirkpatrick.
No.
Mrs. Kirkpatrick, no. Mrs. Lawrence. Mrs. Lawrence, no. Ms. Lee. Mrs. Lee, no. Mrs. Lowy.
No.
Mrs. Lowy, no. Ms. McCullum.
No.
Ms. McCullum, no. Ms. Ming. Ms. Ming, no. Mr. Molinar. Mr. Molinar, aye. Mr. Newhouse.
Aye.
Mr. Newhouse, aye. Mr. Palazzo. Mr. Palazzo, aye. Ms. Pingree. Ms. Pingree, no. Mr. Pocan. Mr. Pocan, no. Mr. Price. Mr. Price, no. Mr. Quigley. Mr. Quigley, no. Mrs. Roby. Mr. Rogers.
Aye.
Mr. Rogers, aye. Ms. Robo-Allard. Ms. Robo-Allard, no. Mr. Ruppersberger. Mr. Ruppersberger, no. Mr. Rutherford. Mr. Rutherford, aye. Mr. Ryan. Mr. Ryan, no. Mr. Serrano. Mr. Simpson. Mr. Simpson, aye. Mr. Stewart. Mrs. Torres. Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Visklowski.
No.
Mr. Visklowski, no. Ms. Wasserman Schultz. Ms. Wasserman Schultz, no. Mrs. Watson Coleman.
No.
Mrs. Watson Coleman, no. Mr. Womack. Mr. Womack, aye. Mr. Carter, I didn't see you on the screen when you voted. Can you recite your vote again, please? Mr. Carter, aye.
No. Sorry. Aye. Yeah.
Mr. Carter, aye.
I have it. The noes have it. On this vote, the yeas are 21, the nays are 29. The amendment is not adopted.
What?
For what purpose does the member from Texas rise? The clerk will read the amendment.
Mr. Cuellar, amendment to State Foreign Operations. The committee is concerned with a high number of grazing leases recently terminated by the International Boundary and Water Commission.
Without
IBWC.
objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The member from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes on the amendment.
19, a statute that got passed by Congress in 1935. Deals with the International Boundary Water Commission to allow them to lease or dispose of property on the U.S.-Mexico border. That was in 1935. In 1954, the U.S. and Mexico built a dam on the U.S.-Mexico border. When they built that dam, constructed, finished in 1954, the water, the reservoir, displaced landowners on both sides of the border, but I'm talking about the U.S. side. So the ranchers and the residents of Zapata County lost all this property. So therefore, what the International Boundary Water Commission, as per the statute of 1935, leased out some property for grazing purposes for the ranchers in only one county, Zapata, because that's where Lake Falcon is at. Over the period of years, this work became labor intensive, and therefore, working with the International Boundary Water Commission, the commissioner, we're asking that we provide them $250,000 so they can be able to comply with the leases, renew them, amend them, do whatever they need to do. So it's just allowing them to do what they were authorized under the statute in 1935. It applies to only one county in Zapata, and asking just for the money so they can go ahead and work on this program itself. That's it. Ask the members for consideration on this amendment.
Are there any members, other members, wishing to be heard on the amendment? If there is no further debate, the member from Texas is recognized on the amendment for 1 minute to close. The question is on the amendment offered by the member from Texas. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The amendment is passed. That's it.
Madam Chair, I have an amendment.
Yes, for what
At the
purpose
desk.
does the member from Texas rise?
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading of the amendment.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with.
Madam Chair, I offer this common sense amendment today to advance our shared goal of more effective and transparent international organizations. The amendment would restore conditions in the bill that have been in place for the last 10 years and that were highly effective in getting reforms accomplished. When I chaired the State Foreign Operations Subcommittee, I added the requirement that some funds be held back until the Secretary of State was able to certify that each of the international organizations funded in the bill were meeting conditions on transparency and accountability. It was a successful tool and we saw good progress. I will give you an example. The United Nations Development Program, also known as UNDP, was notorious for their lack of transparency despite the best efforts of State Department officials seeking reforms. Once the conditions were added and a portion of their funds were held back, they finally began to cooperate. Now we have all their financial audits on a public website. Unfortunately, the bill before us no longer requires that funds be withheld. Instead, it asks for a report. My recommendation would be to put the teeth back in this provision. In addition to those long-standing conditions, the amendment seeks to find a path forward on the World Health Organization. The amendment places reasonable requirements on funding to address concerns that have been expressed on both sides of the aisle. There is broad agreement, even before this pandemic, that reforms were long overdue at WHO. Before I close, I want to address a concern we may hear in response to my amendment. Some may say we should not be cutting off funding to the WHO during a pandemic. This amendment doesn't do that. It doesn't cut off funds. This certification requirement simply says that the WHO has to take steps to conduct an evaluation of the coronavirus outbreak and China's role in it, and they have to be pursuing reforms of the international health regulations. This is not an impossible ask. This is what we should demand of an agency in such a critical position to protect public health. I urge a yes vote on this amendment, and I yield back.
I recognize myself and rise in opposition to the amendment. I have long placed the utmost importance on oversight and transparency at the United Nations, which is why the House Mark continues stringent accountability measures for the United Nations and other intentional organizations. However, over the last 3 years, the administration's substantial delays and abuse of the withholding included in previous SFOPS bills has slowed down the timely obligation and disbursement of funds that the United Nations and other international organizations such as UNICEF and NATO depend on. Needless delays in dispersing funds, as well as politically motivated reviews of international organizations, only serve to weaken our standing on the world stage and deem the United States a far less reliable partner. Not only would my colleague's amendment allow the administration to continue withholding critical assistance, it would also allow the Trump administration's misguided policy toward the World Health Organization to continue. I refuse to let this committee be part of the charade to scape the WHO over the COVID pandemic. Despite the protests of hundreds of global experts around the world, including our own domestic health experts, President Trump has chosen politics over the leading global health organization in the midst of this pandemic. Worse yet, this is not only about coronavirus. The lack of participation in the WHO will affect our progress on polio, our preparations for the next flu season, and even our voice at the table to ensure that the WHO emerges as a stronger organization once we are through the current crisis. Congress needs to ensure that our leadership on global health endures. Finally, and most regrettable, we, the Congress, cannot trust this administration not to abuse the withholding authority, because that is exactly what they have done to suit a tweed or half-baked policy. This administration is forcing us to take these actions in the bill by continue to not act in good faith. So I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment. Are there any other members wishing to be heard on the amendment?
Yeah.
Who?
Ms. Lee seeks recognition.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I also urge a no vote on this amendment. Pandemics, they don't respect borders. We've learned this time and time again with HIV, with H1N1, with Zika, with Ebola, and now again with COVID-19. The only way to truly defeat COVID and help America and the world recover is through international cooperation. Likewise, so many other problems we face in the world today require us to cooperate with others. For example, I too have many concerns about China's behavior, their COVID response, their record on human rights, treatment of Hong Kong residents, their treatment of many minorities, and threatening policies toward their neighbors. But how can the United States rally the world, including our allies, to present a united front against such behavior when we isolate ourselves and refuse to engage in institutions like the United Nations and the World Health Organization that we helped create and that are valued by so many of our allies? I believe that if my colleagues look at the consequences of this kind of amendment, that they will reject it not only as ill-suited for the moment that we're in, but as something that undermines our own objectives by offering it. So I urge a no vote. Thank you again, Madam Chair.
Are there any other members wishing to be heard on the amendment?
Dr. Harris seeks recognition.
Dr. Harris is recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'll be brief. There's no reason to vote against this amendment because of the World Health Organization wording. You just have to read it for yourself. All the World Health Organization has to do is take steps to conduct an investigation into exactly what in the world happened that resulted in the deaths of 130,000 Americans. That's all they have to do. They don't have to conduct the investigation. They just have to take steps to see what went on, and then to carry out meaningful reforms on the international health regulations, including the process for declaring a public health emergency of international concern, because clearly that was not declared in a timely fashion in this case, resulting in the deaths of 130,000 Americans. If we're going to contribute to the World Health Organization, we should ask for them to act responsibly and to address our concerns on this issue. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Mr. Price seeks recognition.
Mr. Price is recognized.
Madam Chairman, I rise in opposition to this amendment. It is, of course, appropriate for this committee to oversee the use of U.S. contributions to the World Health Organization and to ask hard questions about that organization's performance. We are obligated to do that. But that's not really what this amendment is about. It is not appropriate. It is not appropriate. In fact, it is inappropriate and destructive to scapegoat the World Health Organization for a worldwide pandemic which our government itself has mismanaged, and to summarily end cooperation and funding to the World Health Organization in a way that will make the worldwide pandemic and the ability to deal with it immeasurably worse. That is a terrible idea. And that's what this administration has perpetrated. And it's what this amendment would facilitate. We simply cannot ignore the context. This amendment is not occurring in a vacuum. We have to ask about the consequences, I think, in a very searching way. And that leads me to strongly oppose the amendment.
I just, for purposes of clarification, from the amendment, it states clearly that funds appropriated by this act that are made available for the World Health Organization shall be withheld from obligation until the Secretary of State certifies and reports to the appropriate congressional committee that the World Health Organization is taking steps, and then I would continue all your other to conduct an impartial, independent, but the money is being withheld according to the amendment. Is there any further comment?
Ms. Herrera Butler seeks recognition.
Ms. Butler is acknowledged.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to clarify, based on what you just said, the funds are withheld contingent upon them taking steps to. You can drive a truck through that language, it's so loose. All they have to do is demonstrate they're taking steps. There's no massive, immediate report due. There's no overburdening bureaucratic work to be done. Like, they can literally have a meeting and show we're going to take this seriously. We believe that this is worth looking at, and they have to provide that. Taking steps to, I mean, that's not exactly technically difficult language to achieve. I mean, that's a pretty low bar. And for us to say that's too difficult to ask of this organization when clearly they did not respond, there is a lot of question about how they responded to the crisis in the early days and what information they provided. I think this is a pretty low bar just to say, hey, can you guys move in the right direction? I just wanted to clarify that, and I do urge adoption of the amendment. I yield back.
If there is no further debate, the member from Texas is recognized on the amendment for 1 minute to close.
Thank you, Madam Chair. By supporting this amendment, we can help the WHO get serious about reforms while also improving their effectiveness as an organization during this historic time. There should be no disagreement over this amendment that advances the goal of more effective and transparent international organizations. I urge a yes vote.
The question is on the amendment offered by the member from Texas. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. No. The noes have it. The amendment is not adopted.
Madam Chair, I ask for a roll call vote.
A recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote, raise your hand. A sufficient number being in support, a recorded vote is ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt. Mr. Adderholt, aye. Mr. Aguilar. Mr. Aguilar, no. Mr. Amadei. Mr. Amadei, aye. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop, no. Mrs. Bustos. Mrs. Bustos, no. Mr. Calvert. Mr. Calvert, aye. Mr. Carter.
Aye.
Mr. Carter, aye. Mr. Cartwright.
No.
Mr. Cartwright, no. Mr. Case. Mr. Case, no. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark, no. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Christ. Mr. Christ, no. Mr. Cuellar. Mr. Cuellar, no. Ms. DeLauro. Mr. DeLauro, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart, aye. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Fleischman, aye. Mr. Fortenberry.
Yes.
Mr. Fortenberry, aye. Ms. Frankel.
No.
Ms. Frankel, no. Ms. Granger.
Aye.
Ms. Granger, aye. Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves, aye. Dr. Harris. Dr. Harris, aye. Ms. Herrera-Butler. Ms. Herrera-Butler, aye. Mr. Hurd. Mr. Hurd, aye. Mr. Joyce. Mr. Joyce, aye. Ms. Capter. Ms. Capter, no. Mr. Kilmer. Mr. Kilmer, no. Mrs. Kirkpatrick.
No.
Mrs. Kirkpatrick, no. Mrs. Lawrence. Mrs. Lawrence, no. Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee, no. Mrs. Lowy.
No.
Mrs. Lowy, no. Ms. McCullum. Ms. McCullum, no. Ms. Ming. Ms. Ming, no. Mr. Molinar. Mr. Molinar, aye. Mr. Newhouse. Mr. Newhouse, aye. Mr. Palazzo. Mr. Palazzo, aye. Ms. Pingree. Ms. Pingree, no. Mr. Pocan. Mr. Pocan, no. Mr. Price. Mr. Price, no. Mr. Quigley. Mr. Quigley, no. Mrs. Roby. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, aye. Ms. Robo-Allard. Mr. Robo-Allard, no. Mr. Ruppersberger. Mr. Ruppersberger, no. Mr. Rutherford. Mr. Rutherford, aye. Mr. Ryan. Mr. Ryan, no. Mr. Serrano. Mr. Simpson. Mr. Simpson, aye. Mr. Stewart. Mrs. Torres. Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Visclosky.
No.
Mr. Visclosky, no. Ms. Wasserman-Schultz. Ms. Wasserman-Schultz, no. Mrs. Watson-Coleman.
Yes.
Mrs. Watson-Coleman, aye. Mr. Womack. Mr. Womack.
Oh, I'm
aye.
sorry. Correction.
Mrs. Watson-Coleman, you are recorded as
No.
now a no.
Thank you.
While we're waiting for the vote, I'd like to announce we have one additional amendment. After we vote on that amendment and the bill, we will break for lunch and return at 2 p.m. to consider agriculture and military construction, VA. So one more amendment, and after we vote on that, we break for lunch. On this vote, the yeas are 21 and the nays are 29. The amendment is not adopted. For what purpose does the member from Kentucky arise?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk, and I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading thereof.
The clerk will read the amendment.
I ask for unanimous consent to dispense with the reading.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with.
Madam Chair, my amendment would strike controversial new subsidies for international climate funds and instead put those resources to better use by restoring full funding to the Countering Chinese Influence
There's too
Fund.
much noise.
Madam
Where's my-
Chair, the committee's not in order.
My friends, we have one more amendment. Let's all listen to the amendment, and then we can go and have lunch. Thank you for your attention.
Under the Obama administration, there was an aggressive regulatory rampage on domestic energy production and consumption. The impacts were harshly felt in the heart of Appalachia and my eastern Kentucky congressional district. The final nail in the coffin was the Paris Agreement, aiming to ensure that coal could not even be exported to developing countries in need of affordable energy. 12,000 good jobs in my district were gone in what seemed like the blink of an eye. It was a catastrophe, and we're still trying to rebound. In the negotiations leading up to the Paris conference, participants called for a green climate fund that would collect $100 billion a year by calendar 2020. Although Congress has yet to appropriate a single dollar specifically allocated for the Green Climate Fund, the U.S. contributed $1 billion under the previous administration. Requiring an additional $500 million be spent on international climate activities, such as the Green Climate Fund, is an ill-advised use of taxpayer funds. This amendment proposes a smarter investment, one we can all agree on, the Countering Chinese Influence Fund. As I know the chair is keenly aware, China's growing hard and soft power is of increasing concern to the U.S. and their allies. Its aggressive stance in the South China Sea and on the Indian border is deeply worrisome. Beijing has just also adopted, is already implementing, a deeply unpopular national security law that effectively invalidates the one country, two systems protections promised to Hong Kong for 50 years in 1997. In order to counter the wide-ranging efforts by the Chinese government, the communist government, to undermine the interests of the U.S., its partners, and allies, we need resource commitments commensurate with the nature of that challenge. This amendment would help further that very important goal. So on the amendment, Madam Chair, I ask for a yes vote, and I yield back.
I have it here. No one else? Okay. I recognize myself and rise in opposition to my friend's amendment. Climate change is a real threat that the United States cannot win alone. The Green Climate Fund is the best vehicle we have to fight a global problem on a global basis. If the United States refuses to participate, we are demonstrating that we are not serious about this global threat. Climate change is a threat multiplier that increases the risk of conflict, hurting the global food supply, causing displacement and migration, and leading to major shortages of water. We have a moral responsibility to safeguard our planet and ensure our children and grandchildren inherit a clean, healthy future. We also have a national security obligation to protect the citizens who sent us here. Any alternative is unacceptable. I share my colleagues' interest in countering Chinese malign influence, and that is why this bill includes over $200 million to do just that. We already appropriated $300 million into the State Department's new Countering Chinese Influence Fund last year. However, we have yet to see the State Department obligate significant resources from this new fund, and adding even more money in this year's bill would only add to the pipeline. Climate change is as real a threat to our national security as any geopolitical challenge. I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment. Are there any members wishing to be heard on the amendment? If there is no further debate, the member from Kentucky is recognized the amendment for 1 minute to close.
Madam Chair, in closing, this amendment would strike unwarranted contributions to international climate funds and instead plus up our efforts to counter China to the level from the last fiscal year. I urge support of the amendment, and I yield back.
The question is on the amendment offered by the member from Kentucky. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. No. The noes have it. The amendment is not adopted.
Madam Chair, I ask for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of recorded vote, raise your hand. A sufficient number being in support, a recorded vote is ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt. Mr. Adderholt, aye. Mr. Aguilar. Mr. Aguilar, no. Mr. Amodei. Mr. Amodei, aye. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop, no. Mrs. Bustos. Mrs. Bustos, no. Mr. Calvert. Mr. Calvert, aye. Mr. Carter.
Aye.
Mr. Carter, aye. Mr. Cartwright.
No.
Mr. Cartwright, no. Mr. Case. Mr. Case, no. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark, no. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Christ. Mr. Christ, no. Mr. Cuellar. Mr. Cuellar, no. Mr. Lauro. Mr. Lauro, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart, aye. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Fleischman, aye. Mr. Fortenberry.
Yes.
Mr. Fortenberry, aye. Ms. Frankel.
No.
Ms. Frankel, no. Ms. Granger. Ms. Granger, aye. Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves, aye. Dr. Harris. Dr. Harris, aye. Ms. Rare Butler. Ms. Rare Butler, aye. Mr. Hurd. Mr. Hurd, aye. Mr. Joyce. Mr. Joyce, aye. Ms. Capter. Ms. Capter, no. Mr. Kilmer. Mr. Kilmer, no. Mrs. Kirkpatrick.
No.
Mrs. Kirkpatrick, no. Mrs. Lawrence. Mrs. Lawrence. Mrs. Lawrence, no. Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee, no. Mrs. Lowy. Mrs. Lowy, no. Ms. McCullum.
No.
Ms. McCullum, no. Ms. Ming. Ms. Ming, no. Mr. Molinar. Mr. Molinar, aye. Mr. Newhouse. Mr. Newhouse, aye. Mr. Palazzo. Mr. Palazzo, aye. Ms. Pingree. Ms. Pingree, no. Mr. Pocan. Mr. Pocan, no. Mr. Price. Mr. Price, no. Mr. Quigley. Mr. Quigley, no. Mrs. Roby. Mr. Rogers.
Aye.
Mr. Rogers, aye. Ms. Robo-Allard. Ms. Robo-Allard, no. Mr. Ruppersberger. Mr. Ruppersberger, no. Mr. Rutherford. Mr. Rutherford, aye. Mr. Ryan. Mr. Ryan, no. Mr. Serrano. Mr. Simpson. Mr. Simpson, aye. Mr. Stewart. Mrs. Torres. Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Visklosky.
No.
Mr. Visklosky, no. Ms. Wassman Schultz. Ms. Wasserman Schultz, no. Mrs. Watson Coleman?
No.
Mrs. Watson Coleman, no. Mr. Womack? Mr. Womack, aye.
On this vote, the ayes are 21 and the nays are 29. The amendment is not adopted. Is there any further amendment or discussion? Seeing none, I recognize the gentlewoman from Ohio for a motion, and I ask for your support for this bill.
Madam Chairwoman, I move to favorably report the State and Foreign Operations Appropriations Act 2021 to the House.
The question is on the motion. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Madam Chair, I ask for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote, raise your hand. A sufficient number being in support, a recorded vote is ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt? Mr. Adderholt, no. Mr. Aguilar? Mr. Aguilar, aye. Mr. Amadei? Mr. Amadei, no. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop, aye. Mrs. Bustos? Mrs. Bustos, aye. Mr. Calvert? Mr. Calvert, no. Mr. Carter?
No.
Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Cartwright?
Aye.
Mr. Cartwright, aye. Mr. Case? Mr. Case, aye. Ms. Clark? Ms. Clark, aye. Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Christ? Mr. Christ, aye. Mr. Cuellar? Mr. Cuellar, aye. Mr. Lauro? Mr. Lauro, aye. Mr. Diaz-Balart? Mr. Diaz-Balart, no. Mr. Fleischman? Mr. Fleischman, no. Mr. Fortenberry?
No.
Mr. Fortenberry, no. Ms. Frankel?
Aye.
Ms. Frankel, aye. Ms. Granger? Ms. Granger, no. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves, no. Dr. Harris? Dr. Harris, no. Ms. Herrera-Butler? Ms. Herrera-Butler, no. Mr. Hurd? Mr. Hurd, no. Mr. Joyce? Mr. Joyce, no. Ms. Capter?
Aye.
Ms. Capter, aye. Mr. Kilmer? Mr. Kilmer, aye. Mrs. Kirkpatrick?
Aye.
Mrs. Kirkpatrick, aye. Mrs. Lawrence? Mrs. Lawrence, aye. Ms. Lee? Ms. Lee, aye. Mrs. Lowy?
Aye.
Mrs. Lowy, aye. Ms. McCullum?
Aye.
Ms. McCullum, aye. Ms. Ming? Ms. Ming, aye. Mr. Molinar? Mr. Molinar, no. Mr. Newhouse? Mr. Newhouse, no. Mr. Palazzo? Mr. Palazzo, no. Ms. Pingree? Ms. Pingree, aye. Mr. Pocan? Mr. Pocan, aye. Mr. Price? Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Quigley? Mr. Quigley, aye. Mrs. Roby? Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers, no. Ms. Robo-Allard? Ms. Robo-Allard, aye. Mr. Ruppersberger? Mr. Ruppersberger, aye. Mr. Rutherford? Mr. Rutherford, no. Mr. Ryan? Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Serrano? Mr. Simpson? Mr. Simpson, no. Mr. Stewart? Mrs. Torres? Mrs. Torres, aye. Mr. Visklosky?
Aye.
Mr. Visklosky, aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz? Ms. Wasserman Schultz, aye. Mrs. Watson Coleman?
Aye.
Ms. Watson Coleman, aye. Mr. Womack? Mr. Womack, no.
Steve? to go to lunch or what? On this vote, the ayes at 29, the noes at 21, the motion is agreed to. I ask unanimous consent that the staff be permitted to make technical and conforming changes to the bill and report just approved. Seeing no objection, so ordered.
Madam Chair, I ask for 3 days for the minority to file.
Fine. The vote is passed. I thank you very much for your cooperation. This is a very moving moment for me, and I look forward to working with all of you on the next bills. And thank you again to my dear friends, Mr. Rogers and Mr. Granger.